Bill Jones has written an article called The Belt and Road Initiative, A New Trajectory for Mankind. And Bill, you begin this article by saying, when China's President Xi Jinping announced the Silk Road Economic Belt project in September 2013, it took the world by surprise, but it didn't come totally out of the blue. And so maybe you can just give us a sense, both in terms of the events that led up to that, but also the 40-year history, as you elaborate it in this article, of the fight that's been led by the LaRouche movement to bring this into existence.
Well, this is the story that China, of course, had a definite shift at the point that the Soviet Union fell apart. The whole world situation for them, as it had been conceived prior to that, was entirely different. The ideals of the Communist International moved from socialism towards communism. Everything had changed. The Communist Party of China was responsible for the future of the nation, but they had to find a new path, which they had to chart in order to create a strong national identity and a strong pathway to begin to bring the millions of people living in poverty up to a reasonable standard of living. So they started, first of all, they started looking around. They did two things. One thing is that they looked back at their own history to get a deeper look into the real basis of thinking of China during the old imperial period as a nation. What was it that spurred it on? What was it that kept it moving? And they went back and they looked again at the role of Confucius, the great Chinese thinkers, and much of this was revived. In fact, the figure of Sun Yat-sen, who before 1986 was always a figure in terms of the founder of modern China, he was not on any pedestal to any great extent by the Communist Party or people who were a part of the People's Republic of China. That changed as well. And this look back at their history found a very rich basis on which they could work, on which they could revive the Chinese nation. And this is how they see the overall process since the period from roughly from 1979, especially from 1989 with the fall of communism. The other thing they started to do is they started to look around in the world around them to try and pick up on some ideas. And they talked, and they went to many places. They went to Japan. They talked with people in the United States and Europe to try and find a new mode which fit the Chinese situation in terms of reviving their economy. And this was the beginning of what they call the opening up, the reform and opening up period, in which they began to introduce market elements into what was a top-down controlled economy. And they did it very cautiously, as the Chinese always do these things, because they don't rush into something that they don't understand without having tried it first. And they've been very successful in doing that. In fact, they have taken the best elements of the Western economies as it was in the 1960s and implemented that in China to become the second major economic power in the world. But the background of the Silk Road came in that context. As they were developing their own economy, they began the development with the eastern coastal areas as the beginning. The western areas, which were more isolated, more backward, more difficult in terms of the climate conditions, kind of was pushed to the side as they were developing these coastal areas. But they were quite aware that this had to be expanded in that direction. So as the economies in the coastal regions in the east, in Guangdong, in Shanghai, began to develop, they began to work out a way of moving that development into the West. And transport became a major issue. It's interesting because in the 1980s, when they were looking at how to revive China, they were looking at various forms of transport, and they were again looking at the West. And the West, of course, was not building railroads. And so the thought struck them at a certain point that maybe What the West is doing is they're building highways. They're going with airplanes. Maybe we should do that. But somebody came up with a different idea, and part of it was due to Deng Xiaoping, who paid a visit for the first time after many years to Japan, and he rode on the high-speed rail, the Shinkansen. And he said, he made public statements saying, we just have to move a little more quickly. And so that became the basis for looking at the development of the rail system. There was a rail system. Of course, Sun Yat-sen had a model for developing a Chinese rail system. But now we were in an era where things could go much more quickly if you developed the high-speed rail, maglev. All of these things were now on the table, and to some extent had been developed. The Shinkansen in Japan was really the first development of that. And they used this as the basis to bring their country together, to speed things up, to get things moving, both people and transport, which allowed them, of course, to create the interconnection between the coastal regions and the western regions. But of course, the western regions were still somewhat isolated. And so the thought was that if we could develop this transportation grid to extend further out than to China, out into the West, into Central Asia, into South Asia, and into Europe, then we would create a connection between Europe and China, and we would also create a new reason of being and momentum for the development of these Western regions. So the Belt and Road jived quite well with their idea of developing the West. But of course, also in looking back on their own history, part of that history was the ancient Silk Road, which of course was always a matter of discussion within scholarly circles who were looking at this. And this was perhaps one of the greatest for mankind generally, one of the greatest conduits of trade, of culture, of ideas, of music from Europe to Asia, which created an entirely different situation also for the European nations. And so that also played into it, and so that they took a look at this cautious development. And the good thing was that there were forces here in the West, like the LaRouche movement in particular, maybe solely, which was also working on development projects within Europe initially. With the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, we had worked on trying to create a great productive triangle between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Of course, now all of this was, part of Europe as a whole, and therefore you would want to take this very productive area and make this into a center of world production. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, you had the question of what do all these landlocked nations, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, no access to the sea, how do you bring them into the international network of trade and commerce? Again, the issue of building railroads through that region became then the purpose, the project of the Schiller Institute in the early 1990s. And because the wall had come down, we were very much talking to our Russian contacts who knew us all the way back to from the SDI period, but also even earlier than that. And they were interested in rebuilding their Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was an east-west link. At one point, really the only east-west rail link between Europe and Asia. And they indicated to us that we should talk to the Chinese, and they would be very interested. And so contacts were taken with the Chinese, and they were very interested because they had their own view of how this Western region should be developed. And it was on the basis of that the first Silk Road Conference was called in Beijing, and Helga, who had taken the initiative together with Lin on this idea of building the railroads into the East and into China, was a VIP guest and speaker at that conference, which was under the direction of the Ministry of Science and Technology Minister Song Jian. It was delayed a couple of years. It happened in 1996, but it could have happened a couple of years earlier, except that the Chinese, cautious as they were and wanting to broaden the base to some extent, they wanted the EU to be involved in this. And the EU was dragging its feet because they didn't believe in this project. But ultimately, you had Leon Brittan, who was, I guess, dragged to the Beijing conference, shouting and balking. He came and the conference was held, and we gave out a report, the first Silk Road report, called the Eurasian Land Bridge, a new Silk Road, which we got out all over the world. We got it out to every member of the U.S. Congress. We got it out to President Clinton. We got it out to every member of the cabinet. And so that kind of was the basis, the fermentation, which took some years to really develop because we had two major financial crises then, 1997 and 2008. There wasn't a lot of momentum on a type of grand design project as the Belt and Road. But of course, as China developed and as China played a leading role in overcoming, especially the 2008 crisis, they felt both the strength and the will and the necessity of moving forward in this. And so you had President Xi Jinping developing that idea in his 2013 address at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. That was the beginning of the Belt and Road.